Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin by saying I think what's been fairly clear in the contributions from colleagues all along is that the NDP will be supporting the bill. It does some important things. Nobody's going to claim it doesn't. In particular, it adds to categories of folks who might eventually receive witness protection. Those who've been assisting agencies in the federal security or defense or safety realms are added, for example, and those associated with them, friends, family, etc., who may also need protection. And there are any number of contexts that we could all refer to and that we all know about that indicate that witness protection, if anything, is a growing need on the law enforcement side of government. The Air India inquiry was one of the contexts in which we heard that the national security context was a gap in the system. And surely it has to be the case that with other forms and other of terrorism investigations, it can't be much different. Organized crime, the member from Oxford spoke very well about the burgeoning transnational nature of organized crime, how it's becoming, and this has been a trend line for decades, more and more sophisticated. Law enforcement is always playing catch up, and the role of witnesses to actually somehow or other get ahead of the game surely must be very, very important there. And also one area that's very important to those of us from more concentrated urban areas, the whole question of street gangs and especially youth gangs. How is it that we can actually break the codes of silence, encourage witnesses to come forward, such as in the Danzig shootings that took place in Scarborough not so long ago, including how is it that we can use the witness protection program as part of a broader strategy of getting youth out of that environment. So nobody's contesting that the bill, as far as it goes, is a good bill and deserves to be supported. And nobody is saying that the context isn't one that presents a crying need. That said, through working through briefly three themes, I'd like to suggest that the bill doesn't go nearly far enough when it could have. This is the problem. We've had many years of warning. The NDP started in 2007. We had reports from 2008 on that the system needed to be upgraded. And with the upgrading of the system at the level of effectiveness, we've heard all kinds of concerns, including about funding, including about the need for an independent agency from the RCMP to be involved. And we know from the various interventions that have occurred already that those elements really were not addressed. And so it's a lost opportunity. And so at some level, I'd like to think of this as a bit of a battle between the real and the rhetorical. We also went through this recently with respect to Bill C-37, the Increasing Offenders Accountability for Victims Act, which I was involved with when I was on the Justice Committee. Now, the NDP also supported this bill, despite considerable concerns that we had, that it was really totally avoiding actually, any federal public support philosophy for victims, and rather was trusting in a sort of a combination of surcharges that offenders would pay, many of whom were not in a position to pay them, and provincial programs that were a patchwork quilt and often non-existent across the country. And yet the government at that time presented that bill as making a major contribution to support for victims when it was largely devoid of any kind of a federal role with respect to true victim support programs. And again, we supported it, not because we thought it was the greatest bill in the world, but because it added something. And although we had some problems at the level of rights protections, we ultimately felt that those could be worked out down the line. So this is why that I've joined, for example, a mother of a murdered youth from Toronto-Danforth, Joan Howard, whose son Kempton was murdered 10 years ago, literally around the corner from my house, murdered by a handgun. He was a youth worker who contributed in amazing ways to his community. And she's of the view, Mr. Speaker, that we need to focus more and more on the needs of victims when it comes to the kinds of public support mechanisms that we associate with other causes, the kinds of support mechanisms people need psychological support, social service support, and not just for the immediate victims who survive crime, but quite often, and maybe more often, their families, especially when it's violent crime that's taken a life. Now, it's true that provinces jurisdictionally have the responsibility for this, but the specific link to crime means that the kind of victimhood that occurs because of crime is really not taken into account for the most part in most provinces. We get to legislate the criminal code and a bunch of other areas of criminal law through other statutes up here, but we kind of back off when it comes to how do we deal with the consequences of crime. Somehow that becomes purely a matter of another jurisdictional level. And I think at some point the federal government has to, obviously under initiative from Parliament, really catch up to other countries that take victim support programs, public victim support programs, a lot more seriously than we do, rather than simply downloading costs on offenders and provinces and thinking that somehow or other we've accomplished the task. And so I see this bill as falling a bit into the same trap, that it does a fair bit that's important, but at the level of making sure that the system functions in a way that all witnesses that need protection will be protected, which, by the way, is a goal that's necessary for making sure that all crime that can be prosecuted is prosecuted, then it's a bill that falls short. So I move on to the second theme, which is one that's been emphasized a lot, is funding. So the government MPs are focusing often on comments coming from government witnesses, or including RCMP witnesses before the committee, basically comments saying that funding is adequate. And I wanted to read an example that has been read, at least in part, by others. This is from the Associate or Assistant Commissioner Todd Sheen for the RCMP, when he said, quote, "We will immediately increase resources. We have increased the resources allocated to our witness protection unit." He goes on to say then, "I am confident that we have the means to manage the program effectively." Well, what's the problem here? First of all, he speaks of our witness protection unit, quote unquote. Now, of course, the RCMP has its own costs, runs its own program, and sometimes assumes all the costs because it's an entirely RCMP or federal investigation that the witness protection program is latching onto. So it's good to know that he is projecting an increase in resources, but there is no reference here, or recognition even, to the provincial or local police force costs associated with witness protection programs. These levels of government, provincial and municipal, and more particularly their police forces, are charged for the costs. Now, the member from Oxford made clear to us that, of course, costs are saved for police forces. I'm not saying that that's not true. But ultimately, when there are costs that are not simply the costs from the fact that there's an overall system that they can tap into, they get billed for it. And what we know is that there's already a problem of funding for these levels. Since 2007, this was pointed out. We're 2013, and there's no evidence before the committee that that has changed. There was clear and persuasive testimony before the committee on this, and I'll return to some of it as I end. But let me first quote to the RCMP, back to the RCMP, Mr. Speaker. Its own website says, quote, "There are instances when the costs of witness protection may impede investigations, particularly for smaller law enforcement agencies," unquote. What's the second problem with this, apart from the fact that it really probably is only focusing on the RCMP's own costs? The second problem, Mr. Speaker, is that none of this is actually a budgetary commitment from the government. It doesn't indicate anything more than the RCMP itself sees increases in resources. And it's no small irony that this is the case when we know that we're in budget season, and that it wouldn't have been a big deal to coordinate this bill with a very clear budget line item indicating that there would be adequate budgetary support for our partners in crime prevention, the provinces and the municipalities. Every $1 million counts, I recognize that, but a $9 million budget for the last fiscal year for the witness protection program is not exactly a huge budget when we know from all the testimony before the committee, mostly from police services boards, that there is a need. And so I don't think we should end this debate thinking that by having what might be unanimous support for the bill, that we somehow addressed the issue of resources. And I'd much prefer it if my colleagues from across the way would say that, look, the bill does something and it's important and we're supporting you on that. Let's take that. But let's not throw a cloak over it and pretend that we solved the whole problem. Thank you much, Mr. Speaker.